I've just finished watching the first episode, and it's beyond what I thought it would be. You know, I was so waiting and anticipating the message that would come through, and I think only God could have directed you both into this season of the journey, you know, healing, restoration. And I do believe that, wow, God is at work in you both, through you, and in your lives.
I bumped into your latest podcast that talked about just making hard decisions. I just wanted to say you guys are doing a good job, and continue to do the good job.
Hello everyone, and welcome to The Journey, a podcast designed to facilitate healing, restoration and growth. I'm your host, Eric Kabongo.
And I'm Tamlin Kabongo.
And welcome to today's episode. And we have such an interesting topic that we're going to be unpacking, and we're really looking forward to it. But before we do, we just want to put a disclaimer out there. This podcast is for educational purposes only. It might be therapeutic, but it is not meant to replace professional psychotherapy. You need to consult a professional if you require professional advice or assistance. So, without further ado, we are going to get straight into today's topic. So today we're going to be talking about the wounds of the mind. Yes, I know many people often associate the concept of the wound with the body. And so today we're going to be unpacking this topic. And as I'm just thinking about it, I'm sure there are many questions that you might have. What is the wound of the mind? What does it look like to have the wound of the mind? What are the impacts of the wounds of the mind? And again, what do you do when you realize that, you know what, my mind has been wounded? So we're going to be touching on all those questions as we unpack today's topic.
Right, so let's get into it, right? So I think we have to start with what is the wound of the mind? What would you say is the wound of the mind when we talk about it?
Well, before we start with defining what the wound of the mind is, I think it's important for us to first understand, why did we come up with this concept of the wound of the mind? Many people struggle to understand what mental health issues are. And so as a result, sometimes we think just because I can't see something that has some form of physical symptoms, then it doesn't exist. And again, many of us might understand psychological and mental health issues using a more spiritual lens. And because of that, we might say, okay, when someone is going through something that is affecting their mind, we might think of it as, you know, a spiritual attack or some form of demon. And again, there's place for that. But a lot of the challenges that people go through are as a result of some form of psychological issue that they might be going through. And we thought what would be a way to give people the language to be able to articulate these issues that they might be going through, but they don't know how to explain them. That's how the concept of the wound of the mind came about. And so when we think about the wound of the mind, to answer the question, what do we mean by the wound of the mind? Whenever the purity and the integrity of our mind is compromised, we speak about the wound of the mind. And again, in a very similar way to a wound that you would have of the body. There are different levels of wounds. Sometimes something happens and you just scratch yourself. The impact of that will be different from someone who goes through, say for example, an accident and they get a deeper cut. And all of those things will have different impacts on you. And so again, the mind works in a very similar way, where depending on your experience, you might go through something that is just not that much of a big deal. Or you might go through something that's so deep that it has such a huge impact on you. But the concept of the wound of the mind is really about when the integrity and the purity of your mind is compromised. And so what often happens is that we experience the world through our senses, and certain experiences that we go through, our mind is not able to process. And because of that, when our mind is wounded, our emotional well-being is also affected. And that's why you will see that people will go through certain challenges in life where, as a result of the wound of the mind, their emotional well-being is not the same as it used to be. They will go through certain things. And so we'll maybe get to unpack some of the ways in which this manifests in a moment. And so I know there's also kind of a biblical perspective to this concept of the wound. Would you like to maybe just touch on that?
Yeah, and I think, just to, like we said, our podcast really brings together biblical principles as well as the psychological. So today we will be focusing mainly on the psychological aspect of it, but we have to bring in the Bible as well. And so what I really want to just mention is the fact that, the Bible really does connect the mind and the heart a lot. One thing God has really been speaking to me the past few years is really the importance of our heart, and how everything comes from that. And so I actually just want to read specific scriptures that speaks about, the heart and the mind. So we know the famous verse in Proverbs 23, right? About, for as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So we know that we think with our brains, our minds, but the Bible here is referring to the heart that thinks, so we can see the connection between the heart and the mind. And then we'll go over to Jeremiah 17, verse 9 to 10, which says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doing." So we see again this connection between the mind and the heart. And then just the last verse in Matthew 15, verse 10. Verse 10, and then we're going to jump over to 18 and 19. And it says, "When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, 'Hear and understand.'" We'll go over to 18. "But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, and blasphemy." So we see in the Bible how it connects the mind and the heart, and we can see that in this last verse, how sin is actually what corrupts man, what wounds man. And so we can see that as we speak about the wound of the mind, it's kind of like a cycle, right? Where you think, and as you think, whatever you think gets absorbed into the heart, and from the heart that influences your behavior, right? So, yeah, we can really see how the wound of the mind then corrupts the heart and impacts, what it is. So the biblical does focus very much on the heart, and so this is also the reason why we want to speak about this, right? Because the Bible also says, above all else, guard your heart, right? And part of guarding your heart is then checking your thoughts, right? Before it gets filtrated into the heart, because then that can cause you to sin. And so therefore, that is why, we're focusing so much on this, because we can see that in the Bible, it is so important that we take mental note of the things that is in our minds and how, it influences our behavior and how we live life.
And I think it could also be a vice versa thing, where you meditate certain things in your heart, you go through certain experiences that affect your heart, and then they go on to affecting your mind as well. So it's like as much as your mind affects your heart can also affect your mind, and so it's a vice versa, I guess, relationship.
Yeah. And so I think a natural progression then from there would be, how does the mind get wounded? So we know what it means to have the wound of the mind, but how does that wound get there? What causes you to have a wound of the mind?
And you know what? There are different kind of causes, if you may. Some things are like biological, and I think in psychology we speak of the biopsychosocial kind of model. So what this means is there are certain things that happen as a result of your biological makeup, and so you might have certain wounds of the mind or psychological problems that come as a result of how you were born. We see a lot of neurodevelopmental issues where a child is born, maybe the structure of their brain is different from what you would expect from a normal person, and as a result they might have issues like autism spectrum disorder, they might have certain learning disabilities, and so on and so forth. The second one is like your personality disorders. So sometimes you might have someone who's got a certain personality, and I know a lot of the times we joke and say this guy is a narcissist, and I know there's some sense of truth to maybe you noticed something about someone who's very much focused on themselves, and they struggle to see other people, and they think the world revolves around them, and so as a result you will say, no, this guy is a narcissist. And narcissistic personality disorder is something that is almost like you are born with it, and because of the way your brain is wired, and so, or maybe certain early childhood experiences that you go through that get you to be that way. And so the challenging part is that a lot of the times people who go through these things don't even see it. And so besides those kind of biological causes, we also have social causes, and a lot of the times what you see is that the events that happen around us tend to cause a lot of the wounds that we experience. And because of certain experiences that people go through, you see that shapes how they start thinking about the world, they start thinking about themselves, they start thinking about the future. And so generally we have certain demands that the environment that we find ourselves poses on us, and the extent to which you find yourself balancing between the demands of the environment and the resources that you have to overcome the demands will impact whether you get wounded or not. So say, for example, you have a project at work that you need to submit. If you feel like, I'm competent, I've got the time, and I can do this, chances are you're going to do well. You might feel stressed about it, but it's not going to be something that's going to affect you that much. Now, say when you go through a traumatic experience, as a child, or as your brain can only process certain things a certain way. That becomes something that's just way too much for you to make sense of, and as a result, it impacts you in a certain way. You will see that, the demands and the resources do not necessarily match, and as a result, you get wounded. And again, trauma doesn't just affect children, it affects everyone. And the reason why therapy works is because therapy comes as that form of resource that allows you to be able to process certain things that your mind was maybe not able to process. And so you can see how there are certain biological and psychosocial causes to the wound of the mind. And maybe if you can just tell us a little bit, what are some other causes? And I know I've just touched on a few. What other causes are they?
Yeah, and I think I will just go more into the specific stuff, right? Because you spoke like biologically and, socially. And so like if I can just go into the specific things, socially, because there's things that we go through that we don't even notice wounds us. I think especially living in South Africa, there's so much going on. Poverty can wound us. I don't know, we all know, we've heard a lot of people speak about, a poverty mentality, and so you see how that, growing up, without things, really does wound you. You get rich men, rich women, that has that mindset, like, oh, okay, something will happen. I need to save, and so they think like that, and then it obviously affects how they love their lives, right? So we can see that is poverty. Really, it can wound you, crime. You don't even have to experience it, but it can wound you, we are in South Africa. There was a preacher at our church last year at the conference that spoke about, we don't have walls in America, it's one of those things. Their houses they don't have any high walls, so it's that thing with us, we're like, what? We see a house and it doesn't have walls. We're like, I don't think I'll buy that, So it affects us, crime, that hypervigilance that we're always feeling fearful. So it wounds us, and then, obviously specific things like we know, sexual abuse, violence. These are all things that, wound us as people. So yeah, and I think, what I also realized is that sometimes maybe these things happen to you when you were young, right? So, but you don't know that those things happen to you, right? So how would you know that something happened to you? There are certain things that you manifest, right? Certain behaviors that you manifest. So maybe you can just point us to what are some of the things, that you can see in terms of behavior, or how is this wound displayed like in everyday kind of life? How would you say it presents itself?
Well, when someone is wounded or scarred, there are many ways. And again, sometimes you don't know, but sometimes you know that something happened and you might be experiencing, resentment, anger. You might be experiencing, you feel like shame is something that you can also be experiencing because you've gone through like some form of rejection. And it could be aggression, towards other people because you were wounded, you were left hurt and betrayed. You feel a sense of resentment as a result of something that happened, and then you go on to just seeing yourself in a very different way. And so those are some of the things that we can look out for in terms of how the wound might look like in real life. And again, I'm only speaking from an emotional point of view. And I don't know, maybe, would you like to maybe just tell us a little bit about some of the most common, ways in which these things can manifest? Specifically, we're talking about depression and anxiety. What might that look like?
Psychologically, because when you spoke, you shared a little bit more about like everyday things like anger, resentment, fear of rejection. But like we're focusing on a lot on your psychological issues, when it becomes more severe, like you mentioned in the beginning, is that sometimes things are more severe than others, right? So maybe anger is not so bad, but then it can manifest or is more severe, and this is where we see our disorders, right? Like depression, as you mentioned, anxiety as well. So depression, and I know because these are terms now that everybody knows, and like we loosely use it, like you mentioned,
depressed.
I'm so depressed, oh, I've got anxiety, but these are serious, disorders as well, and it's things that is experienced over a long period of time, so if you're experiencing these things for like 6 months or longer, it's not just something, I feel then, next week you're fine, whatever. That is not depression or anxiety.
Because life happens, and sometimes we respond to situations in an appropriate way because of an event that happens.
Yeah.
But then generally you will get out of it and you move on with your life. When you feel stuck for quite some time, then that becomes something that needs to be looked at a little bit closely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things, it's like things that we experience as all of us as human beings, but it's like, is this thing affecting my everyday living? Is it really impacting me? And so with depression, we know that it's things like low mood. Do you have a low mood like all the time? You constantly don't have interest in the things that you used to enjoy. Maybe you were a fun, outgoing person, used to like to visit other people, like to go out with other people, and suddenly it's like you don't want to go out anymore. You're just isolating yourself. And I think a thing specifically with that is that, we're not just, there's a difference between withdrawing and isolating yourself. We all need that break away from certain people for a certain time. But if you feel like you constantly just want to be alone, you don't want to be with anyone else, you just want to be by yourself, that's when we start, you need to start paying attention really to these things, And then with anxiety, this is more things like, being fearful of the future. You're constantly in this tense, kind of state where...
Apprehensive.
Yes, you're constantly worrying about, oh my goodness, what could happen? Maybe something bad is going to happen. You overthink things when it happens. It's like it's like, oh, something happened, and then you start thinking about it too much. You overanalyze and go to bed. You're thinking about the next day. You're thinking about it. So it's something that you're doing constantly, throughout the day. So yeah, even fear of the future, that having a pessimistic outlook on the future. So yeah, these are kind of the things that you can think about, or see that, okay, is this depression? Is this anxiety? And like we said, it must be happening for at least more than 6 months, or 6 months or more, where you are experiencing these things, and is it affecting your everyday life? Yeah, so I think those are just some of the things like psychological difficulties, where we do advise that you take note of and get the necessary help if you need it. Yeah, and so I think that's some of it. And yeah, I think there's more. I want us to actually just stay here for a bit, because I think we really overlook things that we go through and how it manifests, because we are very extreme people, If I'm not like really bad, like to the point of disorder, like where people really start saying, oh, okay, no, that person really needs to go see someone. And then then it's like, oh, as long as I'm not there, then it means I'm fine, And I think a lot of us really brush things under the carpet, like, no, I'm fine, no, I'm fine. This, it didn't affect me, and I've seen it so much, especially in my community, colored community, where, our ladies specifically, they take so much. And you'll see after time that, it starts affecting your health, and then it gets extreme. So we really want to prevent that from happening, So I want us to really, just stay here for a bit and say, like, how can we see the wound of the mind manifesting in different areas of our life? So, if you can just...
And you know what, I actually want to share, like, there was a study that was done. There's this project. It's called the Global Mind Project. So they look at trends of psychological well-being and mental function, for different countries. And so what they do is, what I like is they have these 6 dimensions that they look at. And maybe we can just touch on those dimensions to maybe also give you something to work with in terms of, okay, where you might find yourself and things that you can just think through about. And so these dimensions, they look at things like, mood and outlook, for example. And so this really just speaks to how people manage and regulate their emotions. Are you regulating your emotions well? And what is your outlook on life and the future? And sometimes you feel overwhelmed by things that are happening around you, even though you know you might do well. Because of something that happened or things that are happening constantly, you find yourself not being in a position to be able to manage. Then you almost kind of feel out of control of your own emotional well-being or emotions. Then something is wrong here, something needs to be looked at. Something else that they also touch on is the body-mind connection. And again, just being able to strike that balance. And then I think of trauma, for example. A lot of the times, trauma, when we go through something traumatic, it disrupts that balance between the mind and the body. Sometimes you might be experiencing your body as somebody else's because of all these, horrific experiences that you're experiencing. Maybe you feel like you are restless all the time. You feel like you're having nightmares. You feel like you are very careful than you used to be, and this might be because something happened and it changed everything. And maybe your mind as well, you realize that you're not thinking the kinds of thoughts that you used to think. You become very pessimistic, very negative, and so sometimes you almost kind of have this out of body experiences where your body and your mind are disconnected. And so that kind of balance is very important. And if you find yourself feeling like there is some form of imbalance, maybe that's something that you need to look closely. There could be some wound that you've got and needs to address. And so the third thing is our mind, and how well we are able to think, make sense of difficult situations or events, and kind of plan for the long term. And when you are wounded in your mind, sometimes you can become like a child, where your ability to solve problems, your ability to take on challenging tasks is affected, where you become you only want things that are easy. You don't challenge yourself hard enough to be able to overcome certain things because of something that happened that you might be aware of or that you might not be aware of. Do you want to maybe also touch on the other 3 that, they mentioned? Yeah.
So the 3 that I'll be looking at is social self, drive and motivation, and then adaptability and resilience, And I think if we can just touch on the first one is the social and the self, and we are relational beings. God created us to be relational. And I think, during COVID, we really, even those who are introverts like myself, you really miss that, being with other people, So we were naturally created, as God says, it's not good for men to be alone. We were made to be in relationship with other people, in community with people. And if you find yourself that, like I said earlier, you just feel like you're isolating yourself, or even the way you treat people, why do you just have this anger towards people, or, resentment towards people, or maybe on the other side of the spectrum, it's not just always negative feelings, maybe it's overly nice feelings, there's no boundaries, you're just saying yes all the time, you're just pleasing, you just want to please people all the time, and it's unhealthy, so there needs to be that healthy balance between your relationship with people, like, is it a good, healthy, you allow people into your space, but you also need your space, that boundaries, that it's in place, you are able to say no if you can't, and so forth. And so, just check your relationships. How's the quality of that relationships? And then also yourself, how do you, think about yourself? Are you pessimistic about yourself, about your abilities, about how you can do things? How do you treat yourself? This also will be an indication of, okay, why do I always talk bad about myself? Why am I so insecure? Why am I, I don't care about myself. I don't, again, that healthy balance between self-love, but also understanding that you do have weaknesses, as you mentioned earlier, of the narcissistic disorder, where that is now on the other side, where you think you're like God's gift to earth, And that's like kind of, just in terms of social self, like how you can evaluate really, have I been wounded in that area of my life? And then drive and motivation. This is another thing that I really like. God has also created us to be innovative people, driven, successful. Like that it's in us, in all of us, But if you find yourself that, you're complacent, you're lazy, even like laziness, that is not how God created us, to be lazy. God has placed in each and every one of us something that we are supposed to accomplish, something that we're supposed to create and be and, aspire to be. And so if you find yourself like, what, I've been in this job for like already 10, 20 years and I'm okay. You're complacent, you're okay just with that mediocre lifestyle. You're just fine with it. Adaptability and resilience. So again, COVID, if we look at the example of COVID, that thing knocked the whole world, but as human beings, what do? We adapt, we are resilient, we get up, we have Zoom, we have different things, we become innovative, we adapt easily to things. And if you find yourself that, you just can't, there's no way that you can recover from something, there's no way that you can move on with life, you can't live life like you used to because of a certain thing that happened, maybe a tragic loss of someone, as an example, and you feel like you aren't able to adapt since this person has gone, so, and be resilient, move on. Like we all go through hardships, and it's something that we all go through, but naturally as human beings we learn to just adapt and we resilient, and so if you find that you can't, you just can't cope, that is when you can see that there is that wound of the mind. So I think it was so important for us just to share, in the different areas of your life where this wound can manifest. And I think, like I said, we overlook how often this actually happens. And as we know, in the country that we live in, I mentioned all these things that, crime, poverty, these are things that we are exposed to on a daily. So we would expect that, a lot of us are wounded. And I think if you can just share with us actually the stats, regarding, the mental health and the state of mental health in our country.
And what I like about this study is, they were also able to look at, statistics around well-being when looking at these 6 dimensions and looking at different countries and where they are. And again, for the sake of the conversation, we're only going to focus on South Africa and Congo. South Africa, obviously, because I'm married to my wife who's South African, and Congo because I'm from the Congo. And we can also, we will include a link to different countries, and you can see where your country might be situated at. But in South Africa particularly, they found that 35% of South Africans were distressed or struggling. And this was actually the lowest level when you look at, and this report was released in 2023. And I'm not sure I don't think there's any latest report. And so in 2023, about 35% of South Africans were distressed or struggling. In the Congo, there was about 22% who were distressed or struggling. And so it's interesting that, Congo fared fairly well compared to South Africa, but I don't know why. I think in terms of mental health, but what you also realize is specifically in the Congo, many studies that have been done have found that, because of lack of resources and whether it is human resources and facilities and so on and so forth, mental health is often dealt with through kind of church, and they often use a more kind of spiritual interpretation of a lot of the wounds that people go through, and as a result you don't get a lot of official statistics. And so maybe that could also be something that is playing a role. And another study was done, but this was done a little bit long time ago in 2011. So they did a study, it's called the SASH, the South African Stress and Health Study. And what they found is they found results that were similar to what this study that we are looking at found. About 30% of South Africans will experience some form of psychological problems in their life. And so what that means is that 3 people out of 10 will experience psychological problems. Now, times 10, you would have 30 people out of 100. 30 people out of 100, 300 people out of 1,000. So, and again, you might think to yourself, that's so little. But think of it this way. That 3 people could be you, that 3 people could be your family member, it could be someone you care about a lot. And so when you look at it that way, it carries a different meaning, and it's no longer just a number. It's actually something that affects lives and that needs to be looked into. And I think coming back to the Congo, you realize that as we speak, the eastern side of the Congo is at war. Many of our people in the Congo are suffering and struggling. They are dislocated. They are experiencing the impact of loss, instability, traumatic experiences because of the war and the aggression of the Rwandese. And I just want to say this to my people. On est ensemble. Les gens de Goma, FARDC, on est derrière vous, and we will do what we can to try and support you in this mission, and I believe that we'll come out of here victorious. And you can imagine when you live in a context where there's constant war, where people are constantly dislocated, the impact that has. And I have no doubt that the people of the Goma, the people of the eastern side of the Congo, are carrying wounds that needs to be addressed, and us as Congolese need to stand up and take responsibility and try and do something about it. Now, maybe just to shift the conversation a little bit, we've spoken about, what the wound is, how it manifests itself. Now, what can be done about it?
Yeah, well, I think most importantly, and the reason why we're doing podcasts such as this, is that we're shedding light on, these issues and what the wounds. I think the first thing as an individual is to recognize that, I have a wound, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. Obviously, depending on how severe the wound is, like you mentioned in the beginning, sometimes it's just a scratch, and you need to just talk it over with someone. Sometimes it's deeper than that, and that's where therapy comes in. Where we advise, for people to go that really is, like we mentioned, like symptoms of the depression, of anxiety, or any of the things that we mentioned where you feel like it's really at a level that is severe, it's impacting your daily life, your relationships, and so that's where, therapy comes into play as well. And then just regarding the therapy, we know that it's expensive, right? It's not everybody can afford therapy, and so there are organizations such as Lifeline, SADC, that offers, free counseling. Some of them have kind of like a donation type, where you can pay what you can. And I think the reason for that is also just, if you are going to a therapist that is doing it for free for you, I think that the least you can do is be committed, So if you are going to take on that free therapy, please be consistent, I know a lot of people that we work with, we are willing to do it for free, but we also find that a lot of people, they come and they don't come. You know how it is when you get things for free, you kind of take it for granted. So yeah, just my request, if you are going to take that, please be committed. And sometimes that's why people just say, just pay a 20 Rand so that we know that you're going to come. It's not that we want your 20 Rand, it's just that commitment, to say that this is what your commitment to come into therapy. And, just from a spiritual point of view, ask the Holy Spirit. I think I've mentioned it in the last one of the last podcasts, yes, that ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you, what are my wounds? Because, like I said, all of us has been impacted some way by something, and it's just at different levels, and it's impacting how we're living, how we treat people, and as we said, the heart issue, what will then eventually cause you to sin, as we read in the Bible. So, yeah, ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you, what are the wounds, and then also the processes that you can take to heal. Yeah, and is there more that you can add on to that?
And I think just speaking to especially people who might, draw support from church, seek pastoral counseling, because you might not be able to, attend therapy or, seek help in any other way. And maybe the best way for you is to go to church and speak to Muruti or pastor or priest. Go speak to them. You realize that some of these issues, even if they can't help you because it's out of their scope of practice, they might point you to, services that are available, sometimes even for free. And so the other thing that I would like to also encourage is, especially, in church communities, and I know there is a need for community interventions to be put in place to create, safe and comfortable place where people can thrive, where issues of crime and unemployment can be addressed, because those are issues that need the intervention of the government, and as much as individuals we can do something to address these wounds, it is important that our governments also create environments where we feel safe, where we can thrive, and where we can try and prevent these things from happening rather than trying to cure them. But I think when we focus on the church community, there's also a need for there to be some form of integration of psychological services in church communities, in pastoral care, because as much as issues can be addressed using pastoral counseling, I believe that there's a much greater value that church communities can benefit by bringing in psychologists to do workshops and to host mental wellness events where there is a certain perspective that the church can gain in understanding the wounds of the minds and the different challenges that people are faced with. And I think lastly, this is just an appeal to our government. Sadly, as much as we know that these wounds of the minds are issues that people are struggling with, in South Africa, for example, only 5% of the budget goes to mental health issues. And I think there's a need for more funding and more money to be allocated to these issues in order for us as a profession to be able to do our work properly and for more to be done so that we don't just take a reactive approach, but we are more proactive. Again, my government in the Congo, the reality is that we don't even know, how much is allocated to mental health, if anything at all. And so there's a need for these conversations to be happening in the Congolese communities and spaces so that we can understand that people are wounded, and in order for us to help them, we need to be able to put all the necessary resources in place to help them better. And I think lastly, just to psychologists, we have a role to play as a profession to empower people so that they can change their environments, but they can also develop certain strategies and mechanisms to be able to address challenges that they are faced with. And I know as a profession through therapy we do that, but there's also a need for us to extend the hand, whether it's through community services, whether it's through some form of volunteer work or free therapy that we can offer, especially to people who cannot afford these services. And so I think that's what I can say needs to be addressed at this point at different levels. But I think the interventions need to touch different levels of society, not just the individual. Yeah. It needs to be the individual, the community, the government, and psychology as a profession, all of us coming together to try and do something.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thank you for sharing that. It just gives us more perspective. Yeah, and that's our video for today. And I think what we really just wanted to share is really just put a light on the fact that, the mind can be wounded and the intensity of it can vary. Like we mentioned, it can be either a cut or it can be a deep wound. So we just hope that in this video, you got a better understanding of the fact that, your mind can be wounded and it manifests itself in different ways in our everyday lives. And so we just want you to evaluate your life, see in different areas, how are you affected in some way, and if you need help, okay, like we said, according to how severe it is, we want to see how it has impacted you. And we hope that this video helped you to do that. And so we just like to usually end the video off with a few questions. And the first question is, what stood out for you, of this video? Can you relate to the wound of the mind? And then lastly, just if there's any questions that you'd like for us to address in the next video, please let us know. So we hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you found it helpful. So until next time, we wish you healing, restoration, and growth.
Bye-bye.